Hi. Last lecture on the male reproductive system, we'll look at hormonal control. And as we do this, this slide is exactly the same for the female. Same everything. The only part that's different is where the hormones go, the different gonads, of course. But this part in the brain is exactly the same. So I'm going to run through it now with the male, and we'll come back and review it quickly when we do the female. So we're looking at the brain, the base of the brain, hypothalamus at the top. So there is the hypothalamus. And there are neurosecretory cells. So these are neurons that secrete neurotransmitters. If those neurotransmitters don't bind to another neuron, they go into the blood, and we can refer to those as neurohormones, which is the case here. So let's consider the posterior pituitary first. It's a little bit simpler. So I have the hypothalamus shown by the black bold line, and so there's a stalk, which is the infundibulum, and then there's a posterior pituitary, and the green are the neurosecretory cells. The cell bodies are up in the hypothalamus, the green circles. The axons of these neurosecretory cells extend down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary, where they release their hormone. So the hormones are exocytosed out of the axon terminal. In the posterior pituitary, those are released from the cells and it's picked up in the blood. So there is a capillary bed that surrounds the posterior lobe of the pituitary. So this is a capillary bed, so I'll just call it capillaries. So the hormone is released, gets picked up into the blood, and then is carried off through the systemic circulation. And you remember that the two hormones from the posterior pituitary are ADH and oxytocin. ADH we've talked about extensively with water balance in the kidneys. So the anterior pituitary is a little bit more complicated. It's sort of a two-step process. So the neurosecretory cells are still in the hypothalamus. They're shown in blue at the top, just to the right of the green neurosecretory cells. And these hypothalamic cells, these hypothalamic neurons, release hormones. So these are hypothalamic hormones from the hypothalamus. And those hypothalamic hormones are picked up in another capillary bed. So again, of course, this is blood entering and enters the first of two capillary beds. So the blood flows in to the capillary, picks up any hormones that are released by those hypothalamic neurosecretory cells, and those hypothalamic hormones are then carried from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary gland. And the hormone that we're looking at now is GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. You need to pay attention to the name, the parts of the name, and sort of figure that out. So I'll write that in here. It stands for gonadotropin. Releasing hormone. So it's going to cause the release of a gonadotropin. So that you have to pay attention to and not get tangled up in the wordage. Okay, so GnRH is a hypothalamic hormone. I'll write that in as well, so you remember that. Hypothalamic hormone. It is produced and released from the hypothalamus. And it travels to the anterior pituitary, which is shown at the bottom right. And it's carried through a blood vessel to a second capillary bed. And you remember that a portal vein is a vein that connects two different beds of capillaries. So this is our hypophyseal portal vein. It connects the primary capillary plexus to the secondary capillary plexus or bed. So GnRH arrives at the anterior pituitary. This is a releasing hormone. It's going to cause the release of gonadotropins. So there are lots of different cell types in the anterior pituitary. Some of those cells are sensitive to gonadotropin releasing hormone, and those cells of the anterior pituitary then release the gonadotropins. And those gonadotropins are LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So make sure you spell those out. Luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And now those are gonadotropins, so they target the gonads. And we're going to start with male, but it'll be the same exact story for the female. So that should be hopefully some review from ANP1 when you did the endocrine system. So the thing to keep in mind are the hypothalamic hormones, which is GnRH. That is not a gonadotropin. It's a hormone that causes the release of the gonadotropin. So it's a hypothalamic hormone that's regulating the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases the actual gonadotropins, LH and FSH. Okay, so the next slide takes those two gonadotropins, LH and FSH, to the male gonads. So here's how that basically looks. We have already talked about the hypothalamus releasing gonadotropin releasing hormone, which targets the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary releases many hormones. There are 6 of them that we looked at last quarter. We're only following 2 of those. We're following LH and FSH. And they both target the testes. So the blue is a testis. So the 2 types of cells that we looked at were Leydig cells and Sertoli cells. So let's just take one. Let's just take Leydig cells. So LH targets the Leydig cells, and the Leydig cells produce testosterone. So the testes produce most of the testosterone in the male. Now that has several functions. The testosterone also promotes spermatogenesis. So occasionally, if a male is not producing enough sperm cell, they may look at the testosterone level in the blood. If the male has low testosterone, they may have a low sperm count. So you'd simply give the man more testosterone and hopefully up the sperm count to solve infertility issues. The other thing to keep in mind is that the testosterone that's produced also goes out to the rest of the body, circulates around, and is responsible for promoting male secondary sexual characteristics. Traditionally, the primary sexual characteristics are the genitalia. Secondary sexual characteristics are things like deeper voice, basically longer vocal cords, a more prominent thyroid cartilage, more hair, more body hair in general, larger bones and muscles on average. That sort of thing. And so testosterone from the Leydig cells. The Sertoli cells are stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone, and it's the Sertoli cells, remember, that are involved with the spermatogenesis. And the Sertoli cells produce various different proteins. Let's just say produce, we'll just leave it as produce chemicals. Produce different chemicals or factors. And those chemicals or factors produced by the Sertoli cells in turn stimulate the spermatogenesis. So I'll put a little plus next to that. So the Sertoli cells are doing more than just acting as nurse cells. They are also actively promoting spermatogenesis, and they also produce inhibin. We'll see inhibin with the female reproductive system also. And inhibin, as the name implies, inhibits the anterior pituitary. So as the level builds up to a high enough concentration, it feeds back, and this is our negative feedback loop to sort of shut off the anterior pituitary. If we have enough inhibin, we have enough spermatogenesis going, we just dial back the FSH. Likewise, testosterone also acts as a negative feedback control. It occurs at both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. So as testosterone levels build up to a normal level, they then in turn shut down the hypothalamus and the pituitary so that testosterone levels, spermatogenesis, and homeostasis stays within the normal limits, the normal bounds. So FSH and LH are often sort of released in what's referred to as a little pulsatile pattern. So that's it for the male. And we'll come back and do the female, which is a little bit more complicated, but it's probably a little more interesting. So we'll see you soon.